Hi, welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to easily name ionic compounds and covalent molecules. So the first thing that we need to do when we're trying to name a chemical formula is ask a very important question. And that question is there a metal? Is there a metal in the formula? If that answer is yes, there's a metal, we're going to use the ionic rules of naming. If the answer is no, there's not a metal, we're going to use the covalent rules of naming. So there's two different sets of rules that we need to remember and that we need to know. And just as a really quick reminder, metals are on the left-hand side of the periodic table all the way until you get to like aluminum, gallium, and so on. And then on the right-hand side are the nonmetals. So if there's a metal, we're going to use ionic rules. And if there's not a metal, we're going to use covalent rules. So really quickly, let's go over what our rules are, and then we'll do some examples. So for the ionic rules, when we're writing the name of a formula, the name of the cation goes first. And remember, the cation is the positive ion. Cation goes first. And that's usually the first element that you're going to see in that chemical formula. It's usually the first element in the chemical formula. And we're just going to write that name as it is. The second rule is that the anion goes second. And remember, the anion is the negative ion. It's usually the second element in the formula. But we change the ending of the name of that element to end with IDE. Change the ending to IDE. So for example, if you had oxygen, it would be oxide. If you had fluorine, it would be fluoride. Chlorine, chloride, bromine, bromide, and so on. So the cation goes first. That name doesn't change. The anion goes second, and we change the ending to IDE. For covalent rules, we use prefixes for the subscripts that are in our formula for those little numbers. And then the second thing is that whatever element is second, we're going to change again the ending of the name to IDE. So for the second element in our chemical formula, the second element ending is changed to IDE, just like we said before. So again, oxygen would be oxide, fluorine would be fluoride, chlorine, chloride, change to IDE. And really quickly, let's remember what our prefixes are for the subscripts, for the little numbers that you see in the formula. So for 1, it's mono, 2 is di, 3 tri, 4 tetra, 5 penta, 6 hexa, 7 hepta, 8 octa, 9 nona, and 10 deca. So we use our prefixes, we change the second element to IDE. And I'm just going to add over to our ionic rules, we don't ever use prefixes here. No prefixes. Because you will see subscripts, but we don't use prefixes. And there is one exception with mono. We don't ever use mono for the first element in our compound. Don't use for first element. And we'll do some examples to show what that means. So let's do an example really quick. If you were given a chemical formula, let's say CO, and you were told to name that chemical formula. So the first thing we need to ask ourselves is there a metal in this formula? We have carbon and oxygen. So let's take a look at our periodic table. If you don't have all of these memorized, carbon is number 6 on the periodic table, oxygen is number 8. Both of those are pink, and if we look at our key, pink is a non-metal. So is there a metal? No, there's not. We're going to use our covalent rules. So we need to use our prefixes. So this could be monocarbon, but we don't use mono for the first element. So I'm just going to write carbon. And you see, again, there's not a subscript by oxygen. So that means there's one oxygen as well. But this time I do use mono because oxygen is not the first element in that molecule. So ox, and it's not oxygen. We have to change the ending to IDE. So monoxide, carbon monoxide. What if we had something like MgBr2? So first we need to ask ourselves, is there a metal in that compound? If we look for magnesium, it's number 12 on the periodic table, all the way on the left in the orange in group 2. So that is a metal. So yes, there's a metal. We need to use ionic rules. So the cation goes first, which is usually the first element in the formula, in this case magnesium. So magnesium. And bromine, there is a 2 there, but we're not going to use prefixes because we're using ionic rules. And all we have to do is change the ending to IDE. So instead of bromine, it's bromide. What if we had something like P2O5? Let's find those on the periodic table and see if we have a metal there. P is phosphorus. It is number 15 on the periodic table. It's pink. And O, of course, is number 8. We already did that one. Also a nonmetal. So no, we don't have any metals. We need to use our covalent rules. So in this case, phosphorus has a 2 next to it. So we're going to use the prefix di. So diphosphorus. And oxygen has a 5 next to it, so we need to use penta. Diphosphorus pentoxide. We changed the ending to IDE. Let's try one more before we do one more exception. Al2O3. So first we need to know, is there a metal in that compound? Well, let's take a look. We have Al, that's number 15 on the periodic table. It's that dark navy blue color, which is a metal, and oxygen is a nonmetal. So yes, there's a metal. We're going to use our ionic rules. The cation goes first, which is the first element in the formula, so aluminum. And remember, we don't need any prefixes, which is why I left the 2 alone. I didn't mess with that. And then oxygen turns into oxide, following our rules. So aluminum oxide. So again, you just need to know, is there a metal or not? Then you know if you need to use ionic rules or covalent rules. There is one exception, and that is if our formula has a polyatomic ion. That does change slightly how we name a polyatomic ion. Remember, a polyatomic ion is an ion, so it has a charge. It's actually covalently bonded, but that whole molecule has a charge, and so it bonds with a metal. So a formula that would have that formula would be a metal plus a polyatomic ion. And it's really easy to tell if we're going to use this exception because there's always more than 2 elements in our formula. There's always more than 2 elements in the formula. So look at what we were just naming. Carbon monoxide, there's 2 different elements there. Magnesium bromide, there's 2 different elements there. Diphosphorus pentoxide, there's 2 elements there. Aluminum oxide, there's 2 elements there. If we have a polyatomic ion, there's always going to be more than 2 elements there. And I'll give you an example. If we have something like CaCO3, we have calcium, carbon, and oxygen. So we have 3 total elements, which means there is a polyatomic ion. And it's not the metal. The metal's not the polyatomic ion, which means it's CO3. And all polyatomic ions have their own name. They all have their own name. And unfortunately, these are usually names that you're going to have to memorize. There's a long list. Usually your teacher will give you a certain amount that they want you to memorize. There's a certain amount that you probably need to know for your chemistry class. So this one happens to be carbonate. So if we wanted to name this formula, we almost follow our ionic rules. The cation still goes first. Cation goes first, which is calcium. And then we just use the polyatomic name. So it would be calcium carbonate. And again, that's just something that you need to know on your own. You can't use the periodic table to name that. It's just something you need to know. Another example would be AlOH. So we have a metal, aluminum, and then we have oxygen and hydrogen, which are both nonmetals. So aluminum's a metal, which means our polyatomic is OH. And again, you're just going to have to know what that is. So if we wanted to name it, we would use our cation, aluminum, as the first name. And then the name of our polyatomic ion goes second. In this case, it's hydroxide. Hydroxide. So there is a list of polyatomic ions your teacher probably wants you to know, usually like phosphate, nitrate, nitrate, nitrite, sulfate, sulfite, maybe a few others. So let's do a few more examples. I'll give you guys a few questions and you can see if you can name them on your own. You can just pause the video and then I'll give the answers at the end. You can just skip to the end to see the answers. So see if you can name some of these using the rules that we just learned. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope this was helpful. If you